The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, folks, and welcome to our Compliance Spotlight webinar. I'm Martin Lyons, Business Development Director here at Just, and with me once more is our friend from Thistle Initiatives, James Dingwall. Good morning, James.
Good morning.
Good to see you. I'm glad we've got onto this webinar now so we can determine what is MiFID and what is actually myth. So hopefully we're going to clarify some of that today. The good news, folks, is that we're here for the next 45 minutes or so, and we'll be issuing CPD on this. We'll be coming out next week, along with the video being available on our website as well. So, what MiFID II means to you. Just as a reminder, in terms of housekeeping, we have got the opportunity for you to ask questions or raise your hand. Once again, we have Anna at the controls here today looking after the technology, so she will come to your aid as soon as you press this button here on the right hand side of your screen, which says raise your hand. So if you have anything urgently that you need us to attend to, then we'll come rushing to your aid. If there's any technology issues or anything like that, hopefully there won't be. And there's also a space there, as I'm sure you're familiar with, to ask any questions that you might want to do so. And I'm sure James will be able to help us with some answers to anything that you may have sort of pressing on this issue. And we'll come to that after the main part of the presentation. So, without further ado, hopefully to give us some clarity, I'm sure he will, I'll welcome James. And James, do you want to just kick us off on the session, please? Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this morning. Obviously, I guess the starting point is MiFID II came in January this year. One of the reasons that we've decided to do the webinar is because we're still getting quite a significant amount of questions and guidance requests from firms around the implications of MiFID, what it means to firm, how do they comply, and what are the main points. So the objective very much today is to give participants an all-round picture of the relevant regulatory changes that MiFID II affects. We're going to try and do as many practical examples as possible. I'm sure Martin will have some questions as we actually go through the slides today. The slides are very detailed, so what we've tried to do with the slides, which will be available for use afterwards, is trying to give as much guidance as possible. So whilst we'll go through the slides today, they are very detailed and should be able to give you some more practical advice and guidance as we actually run through. So, MiFID II. So the background, as I'm sure everyone is aware, we started off in November 2007 with MiFID I, with the objective to improve the competitors of EU financial markets, create a single market for investment services, and harmonise protection for investors in various financial instruments, which are MiFID instruments. 2008, we had the financial crisis, which exposed quite a lot of weaknesses in MiFID I. So then we've got a good idea to do MiFID II, which came into force January 2018. Someone did tell me the other day that there is over 10,000 pages of guidance, policy statements, newsletters, of everything like that to kind of read through to understand, and I've got no doubt that creates confusion. So
you read them all, James? Some real page turners in there.
Yeah, the nights have flew past. But fine, we'll cover as much as what we can today as we go through. The key areas that we're going to cover will be shown on the slide in front of you now. I'm also just going to touch on passporting rules as well. Some of you might have also received correspondence that we've received recently from some of the regulators throughout Europe that are starting to ask questions around firms using passporting rights, whether it's freedom of services or establishment of branches. So we'll go through that today. But obviously, as I said earlier, the objective, 45 minutes, there's an awful lot to go through. So we're going to try and touch on the key elements. And of course, when we get to the seminar, first one in June this year, We're going to go through MiFID II in more detail as well, so we can pick that up as well. Right, first starting point. Client categorization and client agreements. MiFID II rules impose more administration and record-keeping duties on firms. Requests to be opted up from retail to elected professional clients have changed significantly as well. There's more rules around that. And MiFID II also extended professional clients the COBS 8 requirement. So firms have to enter into a written basic agreement with retail clients, which basically sets out the essential rights and obligations of both parties, where it wasn't really a rule-based requirement previously.
Okay, so in terms then, James, just to chip in there if I may, I'm just thinking about in terms of a sort of regulated business, what in reality, what does the impact have on firms, and who does it apply to, all of this?
Yes, so basically previously, the starting point for this is really RDR. So when retail distribution review finished, there was a lot of firms, well not a lot, there was a number of firms that decided what they would do was opt up their clients from retail to professional clients. And therefore the training and competency rules didn't apply in terms of qualification requirements.
Okay.
So they basically tried to get around the rules a little bit. So MiFID II has now set in place specific requirements of the process COBS 3.5.3, I think it's in, that you have to actually go through a proper written process with a client to basically opt them up to an elected professional client.
Right, okay. Yeah.
Certainly for more complex investment, the FCA are looking for individuals that have a greater understanding, knowledge, expertise, understanding of risk, liquidity events and things like that. So they've put more detailed rules in around that.
I imagine those sorts of individuals are perhaps few and far between.
It's starting to increase, to be honest with you, quite significantly. We're seeing more investors willing to opt up.
Okay.
The key point is previously the rules weren't as detailed in terms of how the initial conversation actually came about as to opt up to the next level.
Right.
The rules are very specific now on the customer must make that request.
Right, okay.
So that's been one of the...
You just can't assume a level of expertise.
Exactly. But of course, individuals, even if they are elected professional, can still actually go through to the ombudsman now, where previously they weren't able to do so. So that's quite that's quite a significant change.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. All right.
Okay. New definition of regulated advice. So this is a fairly tricky one that's caused quite a lot of confusion. Previously, you would have regulated advice and you would have a personal recommendation. So did a personal recommendation also equal regulated advice? Not always was the answer, but now basically it all falls into one bucket, which is under regulated advice.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but in reality, though, would you say that, you know, I mean, in reality, what changes this definition? Have they really had a major impact then? Because it sounds like it was what people were probably.
Yeah, I mean, it's that itself is a very good question. So the main example I can give you on this is previously, let's say for investment research companies.
Yeah.
They would have the regulated permission of advising on investments, but they wouldn't give a personal recommendation.
Right.
So you would have a scenario where an investment research note would be issued that gave a buy, sell or hold recommendation in relation to a MiFID instrument, let's say a share in a listed company.
Okay, yeah.
So that would be classed as regulated advice, but it wouldn't be classed as a personal recommendation because you're not assessing the suitability on a one-on-one basis.
Okay.
So that research note would be going to maybe 2,000 people who subscribed and paid usually a fee to receive that those tips around those shares.
Right. Okay.
So that's really the main difference there. So you will find now a lot of the investment research companies will no longer have the regulated permission of advising on investments.
Right.
They'll just have arranging and making arrangements, for example, in shares.
Okay, I guess it clarifies some of the points around what's advice and what's just general information that might be a good kind of principle for people to topping up different investments and so on.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm just thinking about, you know, some of the influence that is brought to bear by things like media and things like that. And does it impact on the media side of things in terms of what people can say on your breakfast TV couch and all those kind of things?
The media is always a funny one because a lot of people don't realise that there's an exemption that's actually available for the media.
Oh, okay.
So you actually end up in a scenario where they don't have to generally comply with FSMA or MiFID. They have to comply with their own press association rules in terms of fair and balanced and the rest of it. But there's a specific exemption from media, which is basically if you have a page in your newspaper and the work that you're doing around financial services is incidental to your main activity, i.e. media services, you don't need to be
on a different set. Interesting. Okay.
Generally.
All right. Okay. Let's clarify that. Thank you.
Next one we're going to touch on is just independent advice. Has anything really changed around independent advice? Not really. You've got to obviously disclose whether or not the advice provided is on an independent basis. That's what everyone did anyway.
Yeah.
State whether the investment firm will provide the client with a periodic assessment of the suitability of the financial instruments. Most people did that anyway. So there's not really been much change around that. However, the FCA, well, through MiFID and the FCA, the guidance is very much a lot clearer now on the basis that there's an obligation on the investment firms to ensure that they assess a sufficient range of financial instruments available on the market to be classified as independent. I think most firms generally did that anyway.
Yes.
You kind of start with what does everything look like, and then you narrow it down and get the most sensible outcomes for your client base as that actually proceeds.
So when you talk about sufficient range, then that doesn't necessarily mean the whole universe of things necessarily, or is it just being realistic?
Yeah, it's being realistic and sensible.
I remember a few years ago, it was people really took that to the nth degree, I think.
Yeah, and I think that probably ended up with a load of unregulated collective investment schemes in all sorts of portfolios and all sorts of stuff, which is going back to quite a few people on the bubble.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. All right.
That's fine.
Okay.
And then this is one of the next key changes, really, which is around appropriateness and the distinction between complex products such as CFDs and things like that, synthetic ETFs and other non-complex products such as just basic ETFs that are not synthetic and things like that. But the appropriateness test must be carried out when a firm executes or receives or transmits a client order. Usual example, and this is a stockbroker, on an execution-only basis where they're trading on behalf of their clients in relation to shares on a regulated exchange.
Right.
Firms also need to record the results of the appropriateness test with the client, including basically when a warning has been given to the client, but the client wishes to proceed. There's a bit of a get out in the regulations on the appropriateness test, because even if a client does fail, you can actually you can send the client a written warning to say you failed, didn't think you're suitable, click this disclaimer and then continue to trade. Whether or not that's the best outcome for the consumer, probably not.
Yeah, I mean, I was doing some work on things like consumer vulnerability, and now we're coming on to suitability of products a bit later on, but there is this whole balancing act, isn't there, between, you know, having products that do everything you need them to do, with lots of bells and whistles, and actually consumer understanding of some of these things it seems to be a thing that's being highlighted at the moment.
You've raised a very good point there on consumer understanding, because one of the most significant changes to the appropriateness test since MiFID II is basically under MiFID I, the appropriateness test was very straightforward. So
Yeah.
you could have as few as 3 questions. One might be, are you an idiot? 2 might be, do you want to lose all of your money? And 3 might be, do you understand that this investment isn't covered by the compensation scheme?
Right, yeah.
And if the customer answered those 3 questions right, you would actually end up with it potentially being suitable.
Yeah.
It's very much changed now to an actual test.
Okay.
So the FCA are very much pushing for detailed questions to try and get interaction with the customer to make sure that they actually understand, and specifically the product that they're going to be using. So before, it used to be very open appropriateness test. You'd go in and you'd be suitable for leverage products, derivatives and basic shares.
Yeah.
Where actually now what they're saying is you've got to have the appropriateness test that's very, very specific to the types of products and services that that client is going to use.
Right, okay.
So if you take worst case instrument contracts for difference or something like that, which is a leverage product or an underlying asset, which could be anything from cryptocurrencies to kind of shares in a FTSE 100 company, you will get more questions now around, do you understand what a leverage product is? How does it work? How does it operate? So rather than just a test, rather than just a few questions in a tick box, it's now very much driven by a test.
Yeah, it's not just general understanding of financial products. It's about that specific thing that you're looking at.
Which is the best way to go, because
the
last thing you need is consumers getting involved with products that they don't really understand.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's helpful. Thank you.
The 10% rule on portfolio management is it's still getting questions asked all over the place now. It's very kind of difficult, and I think that it's knowing what the responsibilities are and who's actually meant to be issuing the notification to the client.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the areas that we're getting a lot of questions on. I know I've read certain things that some people think it's a good idea, but, you know, in terms of long-term investments, well, you know, how appropriate is it? But it's one thing that we do get a lot of questions on, and certainly questions around, you know, who notifies the client.
Yeah, exactly. So you end up, let's take a model portfolio services that's on a platform. Yeah. There's generally 2 structures that you can get. So the discretionary fund management firm that's providing the MPS will either know who the end client is or will not know who the end client is.
Right.
So then you end up in a situation where if I don't know the end client, who's actually then responsible for actually issuing the notification, should the 10% rule actually come into play? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you have another scenario where you have the MPS that's held through a structure such as a nominee company. So so what you find in that scenario is that the discretionary manager of the MPS will actually know who all of those clients are. So in that scenario, if the discretionary fund management provider of the MPS knows and understands who their clients are, it's their responsibility to issue the notification should the 10% rule actually apply.
Yeah.
But if they don't actually know who the end client is, it then falls back onto the platform, doesn't really?
Goodness.
So it's all very complex. And you end up with a chain of companies that are actually involved, because you could have everyone from the discretionary portfolio manager. You then could have a custodian or a nominee company.
Yeah.
You then have the platform.
Yeah.
You then could have a separate company that holds and controls all the client money. So you end up with everyone looking at each other.
Yeah, the end advisor as well, who's in contact with
the end advisor,
yeah.
and you end up where everyone looks at each other, starts pointing fingers at everyone because they don't understand the distribution chain.
It reminds me of that fable you used to hear, you know, the story about 4 people named everybody somebody. Was it anybody and nobody, and that there was an important job to do, and everybody was sure that somebody would do it. I think it was anybody could have done it, but nobody did it, and I think somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job, and so, you know, and everybody thought anybody could do it, and so on and so forth, and you could end up falling through the cracks, couldn't you, on this, James?
Yeah, very, very easily, and my advice would be if most firms doing it, but the fact that we're still getting quite a lot of questions on this is very much to understand the chain of companies that are involved, and if you are relying on third parties, make sure you have a contractual relation to do it.
Yes.
To be perfectly fair there, I mean, the 10% rule is is basically relative to the value at the beginning of each reporting period. If it depreciates by 10% and multiples of 10% thereafter, but those occasions in most portfolios are generally uncommon, because you look at an average balanced portfolio, having suffered 10% in the relevant period, like for example within the reporting period, you end up in a situation where that actually happens very, very rarely.
Yeah.
It generally happens more in terms of spread bets, CF contracts for difference, leverage products, some of the ETFs and things like that.
Yeah.
That's generally where it's applied. But of course, it could apply if you've got a not very good or a big substantial swing in financial markets could apply there, or you've got an MPS that's high risk, for example, and that's where all of the complications come in, because generally you could have a client who's in an MPS who has 5 different portfolios and is involved in each of them.
Yes,
so it becomes very complicated, but it's worth spending quite a lot of time on that point.
Yeah.
To make sure that everyone understands the actual chain of events.
Good practice would be going through all the client files and having a tick box checklist of who does the notification in this circumstance, so that you know that's all covered off.
Exactly, that's exactly the right case. And one of the other kind of key changes that is around product governance. I think there's over 50,000 regulated firms now in financial services,
right? And
there's about 5,000 or so, maybe a bit more, work at the FCA. And what the regulators are trying to do is push as much responsibility more than ever onto product providers and distributors, like just for example, to ensure that the products that they actually design meet the needs of the customer database that they're actually trying to actually market their products to, and that it's clear, it's transparent, fees and charges are clear, costs is unbundled and things like that. It's very much around transparency, and the FCA have always had what's known as the responsibilities of product providers and distributors within the handbook, and we've obviously had TCF outcomes and we've got conduct risk outcomes, but PROD, the new product governance handbook, sets out the product governance requirements in a very detailed manner.
Okay. And
what we're seeing, just being as an example, is a lot of the product providers actually doing an awful lot towards their IFA wealth management client base, to make sure that when they design products, the IFA or the portfolio manager understands what they're getting involved with, and more importantly, then they can go out to their client with the correct literature and be able to be educated to discuss that point. Yeah.
I mean, it is that tracking to make sure that, I guess, for product providers like ourselves, that the target audience, if you like, that the product is designed for is effectively where it kind of ends up in the end of the process.
Yeah, it's the manufacturing of the financial instruments that actually are produced, whether it applies to all of the product providers and distributors that are out there. And I think from just the firms that we work with, the help and support that the product providers and manufacturers give to the firms that advise on those products is better than probably what it's ever been.
Yeah.
And I think firms are realising it's such an important area of distribution to make sure that they engage.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting now, obviously in the pensions environment that we're in at the moment, particularly post-freedoms, the numbers of people that are doing something, other than what would have perhaps been seen as a default option prior to freedoms, are getting involved in all sorts of complex types of arrangement, I guess, now, and it's really just making sure that that's the the most appropriate thing for each individual client, as it always has been. But
Yeah.
I think there's that more scope now, isn't there, to get involved in things that, you know, certain clients wouldn't have in the past got involved with.
Yeah, and I think that's a very key point. I mean, there was a well-known wealth manager who recently went into administration and lost its license with the FCA, where some of the products that were ending up in their model portfolio services just should not have been there from the outset. And it's through that kind of allocation of the retail IFAs, or retail financial advisory firms, not really understanding the model portfolios that they were advising their own clients on.
Right. Yeah.
And there was all sorts of nonsense in there, which is why the firm has lost the license. And the SEC have been involved with it. There's been obviously police investigations into some of the shareholdings within the MPSs and things like that. So it's.
I mean, if you go back a couple of years to, again, I touched on it earlier, this whole vulnerability piece, and there was that whole piece in Occasional Paper 8 where they talked about people really finding it difficult to understand the difference between sort of marketing literature about a product and then the underlying mechanics of how it all worked, and that sort of comprehension of those aspects was actually quite difficult for a lot of people. So yeah, all interesting points on that.
It is, and the pension market is obviously been through some quite significant changes, and whilst you could look at MiFID II and say, well, it applies to this, doesn't apply to that, we all know it works as best practice.
Yeah.
So when you have guidance that comes out, you know the thoughts of the regulators of where they actually want you to be.
Yes. Yeah.
So when you go back to advising on pension transfers or annuities and things like that, when you look at how the product approval process works in terms of the assessment of training and competence, you've got to start right with a product provider and work through and say, let's take an annuity, for example, the literature that you produce, and how that goes through your marketing firm, how that goes to your distributors. Then you look at how the training and competency works around that.
Yeah.
What have those individual advisors in that firm actually done to make sure that they fully understand what they're advising on?
Right.
And this is where I think it's very important for product providers and distributors to help the market as much as possible to make sure they understand what they're advising on.
Yeah, clarity is key, I think.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
completely,
Yeah.
completely understand.
Okay.
So, brings us nice on to disclosure, I guess, doesn't it?
Nice little segue there, James.
Yeah. So the FCA has published new, more detailed cost and charges disclosure requirements for firms doing MiFID businesses. For a lot of regulated advisory firms, i.e. non-MiFID firms, unless the firm is Article 3, which some of them are, the rules that apply in relation to the cost and charges are unchanged. The piece that we've taken from MiFID II and the FCA guidance that's been issued on the back of it is very much transparency. Massive focus on transparency. And it's published around new disclosures, provisions relating to firms doing cross-selling, bundled products or services, post-sale reporting requirements, record-keeping requirements, and things like that. That have been the key changes across.
Yeah.
And as always, what we generally find is the FCA gold plate a lot of the regulations that come into force. I mean, we do a lot of cross-border work.
Okay.
And it's interesting to see how different countries apply a different set of standards. So, for example, just going off and doing a scenario in the UK to sell a general insurance product, training and competency regime doesn't mean you have to have minimum qualification requirements.
Okay. Yeah.
But if you go to the Central Bank of Ireland, their threshold is much higher than what is at the UK in relation to advising on contracts of insurance, where you've got to have minimum qualification requirements.
Yeah.
So we see as you move throughout Europe, you see a lot of changes around regulators trying to actually set standards in their own way and taking parts of MiFID and other regulations and actually increasing the standards in their own countries.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that sort of harmonisation goes, obviously given where we are with Europe at the moment, but we'll see what the future holds on some of those issues. We'll
pick up on that point now, because it's quite interesting. Over the last few weeks, we have a regulated firm within the group that does passporting throughout Europe, and we've actually started to receive correspondence from the regulators where we either have a branch passport or a freedom of services passport.
Okay, yeah.
And they're inviting us to make an indication whether or not, say for example, we do a reasonable amount of work in Ireland. They're asking us whether our intention is now to actually get approved over there once we come out of the EU. Yeah. So that process is starting now. And what I would say to firms is, you really need to start planning for it. If you operate on a passport throughout Europe, either through freedom of services or the establishment of a branch, you now need to do something about it, and you need to look at the risk of it.
Yeah, certainly if you're getting asked those questions, I'm sure other people will.
Yeah, absolutely. And most of the key, what I would call EU regulators, have now actually opened discussions with firms, and they're doing actual packages, like where if you're already authorised, it's much easier for firms to get through if they meet the threshold conditions. It's a really good starting point to actually start to make those approaches and look at the assessment of where you actually operate as a firm throughout Europe.
Wow, that's good points that I don't think necessarily everyone's thought about, but
I think it's one of those items that goes on the to-do list and keeps getting put back until something triggers it along the line. But I think it's time for firms to start to look at the impact of that.
Yeah. Okay.
So disclosure requirements: no standardised format setting out how firms should calculate and disclose point of sale and post sale information. But of course, everyone gets guidance from the regulator, and why wouldn't you use the guidance that's been given? It kind of sets the standard of what needs to be done. Very much MiFID II provision here that the FCA has implemented rules to reflect MiFID II requirements for the provision of reports to clients and the services provided, including costs and charges, 10% depreciation reporting of client requirements to a client's managed portfolio and things like that.
So flexibility in how you disclose that, though, you're saying?
Yeah, there's an element of flexibility, but there's guidance that's been published out there.
Yeah.
And I guess the next bit that we'll go through now is the kids and the PRIPs, which is another area which is causing a fair amount of confusion as to who's responsible for the actual distribution of them and actually establishing those documents.
Okay. Yeah.
So all advisors need to be aware of the requirement to issue a KID whenever they distribute packaged retail insurance-based investment products to retail clients, and the requirement came into force in January this year. The key question we get asked is, what does a KID actually look like, and what does it actually include? So you've got investment objectives, risk and rewards, associated charges, historical performance, which is quite a topical subject really, and then the authorization status as well.
From like past performance issue, the rules have changed slightly in terms of the 5-year rule and this kind of thing. But what if you haven't got any? This is a new fund.
Yeah.
Simulated past performance. I know that's been used in the past.
You can still use simulated past performance.
Okay.
But the rules have tightened up a bit on that. One of the main issues with the production of KIDs is that if it's done over, let's say, 5-year period, and the markets have done really well, it can you actually end up in a scenario where you forget the 10 years before, and it actually produces something that looks like it's really good, well performance. I mean, if you think about where the markets are now, 5 years ago, they're on a nice little spiral going upwards, so that the performance can be skewed a little bit. And the FCA came out with just some further guidance on this back in, I think it was beginning of February last year, which basically said where the PRIP manufacturer, i.e. the product designer, is concerned that the performance scenarios in the KID are too optimistic, they may mislead investors in any way. The FCA are comfortable with firms providing more explanation materials to put the calculation into context and to set out in a fair and more transparent manner so the client is actually able to understand the performance of the product.
Yeah, no chance of misleading there or anything. Certainly we're a long way past 2008 anyway in terms of those sorts of things. So
absolutely,
again,
yeah. And another thing as well is the customer is when actually does a kid need to be actually provided to the client? The answer is in good time before the transaction's actually concluded. It's not post sale; it's pre-sale.
Making sure they got that up front.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So the relevant rules, research-related inducements has changed quite a lot, very much more detailed now around inducements. Rebating of inducements is now completely banned in relation to retail clients in respect of both independent and restricted advice. That is now in black and white.
Yeah.
Apply. The FCA have got quite a significant bee in their bonnet about inducements being paid, and we've seen this in the pensions market as well, around the use of rebates to introducers, whether they're regulated or unregulated introducers as well. The FCA having a really big clampdown on inducements.
Yeah, is this where there's a lot of talk about obviously tools and other services? You know, does that come into this arena as well?
Yeah,
providers, giving a TVAS tools and all this kind of thing.
Yeah, it all falls into this. But I mean, I always go back to the practical kind of understanding. If there's going to be a benefit to the consumer. And it's in a clear and transparent manner, and you're not getting big paybacks and inducements on the rest of it, then it can only be a positive.
Right.
It's whether or not it creates conflict of interest in relation to whether or not that product provider is being used for giving the tools that actually exactly. And of course, then we kind of go into to bundled services, and the key thing on this is when an investment service is offered together with another service or product as part of a package, the investment firm must tell the client if it's possible to buy the different components separately.
Okay.
So previously would have all been bundled together, and there would be a bit kind of lack of transparency around the fees and charges that are actually applicable. So that is now very clear what the firms actually have to do in relation to MiFID insurance with their retail clients.
Right. Okay. So I mean, from a practical point of view, what does that mean? What do people have to, what do people have to do around the bundled services? Because I remember the Open University did a study recently. They talked about this thing called price obfuscation. Sounds like to me like something you want to have on Call My Bluff. In fact, you're there to describe what obfuscation means as the next word. But I think one of the things they talked about there was complex investment and pension products. So what practical steps does that mean for advisors?
Yeah, I mean this is two elements of it. Is one, it's complete transparency on all the fees and charges that are applicable. So you can't just say it's £100 a month and that's the end of it, and everything goes in between that. So you need to really provide clients with an aggregated figure of all the costs and associated costs for the investment services. Yeah, which must be provided upfront and in a clear and transparent manner with your clients. Yeah. You need to understand exactly what they're paying for and what services they're going to get.
Really getting under the bonnet there of those things, yeah.
Exactly, and they've got to have an illustration of the impact of the clients from the product provider when they actually go through that route, to actually understand what the implications of those fees and charges are of their product and how it's actually going to have an impact on their investment.
Okay.
So we've written through quite a few slides there, and I'm just conscious that we're just getting towards running out of the time, and we try to keep to it as much as possible.
Yeah, of course.
The key elements of changes with MiFID II. CIS 10, a conflict of interest, requires firms to have in place appropriate rather than reasonable steps to identify and manage conflicts of interest. Every single investigation that we've worked on in the last 6 months, or every single firm we've worked on in relation to communications with the FCA, has all asked for their conflicts of interest policy and a list of their conflicts that are actually applicable to the firm. And there's a lot of vertically integrated firms. There's a lot of firms now that have their own DFMs and things like that. And they've really got to be aware of the conflicts of interests that actually could occur within their business and how they actually manage them. So it's not just now about we take a reasonable step, we identify it. You now need to go into the detail of how you actually manage that conflict of interest.
So what they're saying, are they basically in a nutshell saying that we know that there are areas that make fantastic business sense at the moment. But the bottom line is, from a TCF point of view, yes, it's great to be in these areas, and there are potentially some conflicts there, but ultimately, we need to make sure the client's taken care of, and that's got to be the lead rather than, we're writing this kind of business for this, for this particular purpose in terms of
completely.
Okay.
Remuneration policies. Now, this is a very kind of specific MiFID II implementation, but we're seeing this being gold-plated across kind of all sectors now. So the main question around the remuneration policies is the whole objective is to encourage responsible business conduct and fair treatment of their clients. So if you have, let's say, a head of sales or a chief exec, that's chief exec being the best example, who's solely remunerated around the performance of the firm and forget everything about good treatment of customers, compliance outcomes, regulatory outcomes and things like that. The aim of the remuneration policies is actually to stop that and to get firms to think about more in relation to what good and ethical behaviour actually looks like.
Okay. So that's part and parcel of that, linking to that.
Exactly. And you've also got a senior management certificate regime that I think is due technically still to come in at the end of this year, which is all around roles, responsibilities and governance. So firms can actually understand who's responsible for what, where and when. So more if the FCA comes in and they say who's responsible for operations and risk, everyone doesn't point at each other in the business. That's your job description, that's your role, that's your responsibility.
We've ordered somebody, nobody and everybody.
Back there again, are we? Yeah, absolutely. The key area of some changes around client money costs. I know it doesn't apply to every firm, so we'll just quickly have a run over this, because one of the changes and the impacts on this is around specifically in relation to the CF10A function, which is where you're a medium cash firm, not just a small cash firm, so you're more than $1 million. So you have to thoroughly understand that the individual has sufficient skill and authority to be able to allocate their responsibility. So this now is actually going more into general T&C. So you've got very specific instructions on CF10A, but we're seeing more than ever the FCA ask questions around competency of individuals, especially pre-application. They've been doing quite a lot of work around that. So how does the firm pension transfers, for example, we've seen some changes here. So how is the individual competent, not just based on qualifications, but on experience as well, to be able to advise on that complex area?
I suppose there's some ongoing things for that as well. So it's keeping knowledge up to date and all those kind of things, as well as just not where they are at one point in time.
It's certainly not just in relation to once you got your qualifications, you then classed as competent. That's one element of the process.
Okay.
And then we'll jump onto call recording here. So there's been some changes around this. The FCA amended its original proposal to require advisors to tape telephone calls under MiFID II by saying they can also make a written note of the conversation. I think the concern around this was the amount of cost that it would actually take for everyone to implement telephone recording. But certainly for MiFID services, then you need to do the call recording.
Okay, so what are the main changes there then? Because is it very much set? It's how do you record that information?
Yeah, so you have if you have a VoIP line and you record it, and then you take the telephone recording. But the main change is basically under MiFID I, the rule was that you had to retain the calls for 6 months and 1 day.
Right. Yeah.
So now the minimum period is went up to 5 years.
Wow.
So minimum of 5 years. Plus, they've also brought in another rule that says that you've got to be able to evidence how you can get easy access at the drop of a hat to your calls. So quite often when the FCA want to get hold of some calls, the firm would say, yeah, we'll come back in a few months when we went back to our third-party provider and tried to download all of the calls. It's not good enough now, so there's been some key changes around that as well.
So does this, just as an aside, does this have to be in place absolutely now at this moment in time?
January this year.
So it's one of the ones that it's not just you've got a plan for it, it's actually got to be. Yeah, okay.
And then we look at the Article 3 financial advisors that opt, instead of recording calls, for example, to make a written note of the conversation.
Right.
It must include key points, date and time of meeting, location, attendees, initiator, relevant information about a client order if they buy shares, for example, for price and volume and things like that. So all of that must be documented very thoroughly and very well.
Okay.
All of that's in place now.
In some way, shape.
One of the and that's kind of where we get to. I think we're just slightly over the 45, aren't we?
Yeah, I'll see if we maybe got a little bit of time. I think we answered those. Certainly, a lot of learning objectives there, or that I think you've delved into, and of course we've gone down a few different avenues, perhaps, and the conversations flowed and covered quite a lot of areas there. But
maybe we've got a couple of questions.
Okay, let's have a look. See if we've got some time. Here's one for you, James. Thanks for everyone for putting your questions to you, James. So, tying into what we've just been talking about, actually, do the FCA expect firms to have implemented MiFID II by the January deadline?
Yes, black and white, it should have been, but to be honest with you, we're finding firms now that still have some gaps in relation to, for example, telephone recording or finding out the structure of who's providing all the reporting, things like that. If you haven't been able to implement MiFID II, make sure you've got an action plan together with the deadline dates of actually when things are going to get done. And we generally find that's all right.
I'm sure there's places that people can get help from. That, we can put them in the right direction. How about this? Where is the best place to get more detailed guidance? Got a few questions like this. And responsibilities on the 10% issue.
Yeah, the FCA came out with some really good guidance on that, so we can put them the links to when we make these slides available, so we can put the guidance on there. If you've got any questions, go to your usual contact point, and we can pick it up from there.
We're not going to send over the 9,000 pages, are we, James?
No, absolutely not.
All right.
And we can pick some bits and bobs up from there.
Okay. Just got time for one more, I think. Has the definition of independent advice really changed? I guess that goes back to...
Yeah, not really. I mean, the main change is the FCA have now made it more black and white and rule-based in relation to you've got to consider, obviously, the broad spectrum of investments across the board, rather than before it was just an intention to do it.
Okay. All right. I think we're probably, as you say, we're sort of time's pretty much against us. We don't want to sort of people hanging on for too long. So thanks very much again, James. And as you say, we're going to make this information available to people sort of next week around the video and the other bits and pieces that you've mentioned.
Yeah, and I've just seen a few more questions that have just popped up at the end there. Then what I'll try and do is I'll try and get back to those other questions for some of the more technical responses and see where we can get to.
Great. Okay, and don't forget, James, you're joining us on the 26th of June at Knutsford in Mere.
Yeah, and looking forward to it.
Yeah, and the 27th of June at the Amber in London, that's Charing Cross.
Yeah.
So it's 26th and 27th of June, the sort of north and South compliance forums.
Yeah, and I think what we'll do, obviously, we'll cover the pensions, MiFID II, we'll touch on GDPR and things like that. And we'll try and give as many practical examples and answer as many questions as we can on the day as well.
Great. Thanks for your time and input again today. I hope it's been useful for people, and join you on the next one. Thanks very much.